In the heart of Birmingham, Malik Johnson's peaceful evening is shattered by a brutal encounter with Officer Greg Hartman, who accuses him of a crime he didn't commit. This harrowing incident, captured on video by a neighbor, ignites a firestorm of public outrage and debate. As Malik grapples with the humiliation and injustice, he becomes an unwitting symbol of resistance against systemic racism in law enforcement. His journey is fraught with challenges, from online trolls questioning his integrity to the painful realization that even those close to him harbor doubts. Yet, amidst the chaos, Malik finds strength in his family's legacy of resilience and the support of allies like Sarah Chun, a determined lawyer, and Marcus, a friend with a powerful connection to the police force. Together, they uncover a pattern of misconduct and corruption within the department, risking everything to expose the truth. Malik's fight isn't just for himself. It's for every person who has been wronged by a system that values power over justice. Will he find the strength to overcome the odds and bring about change? Discover Malik's inspiring story of resilience and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Let's start. The evening air was warm, heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine that lined the sidewalks. Malik Johnson walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, his mind wandering to thoughts of legal briefs and courtroom arguments. He carried a worn notebook in one hand, its pages filled with scribbled ideas for dismantling systemic racism within law enforcement. Each step he took echoed faintly against the quiet neighborhood, a rare moment of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. But tranquility is fragile, easily shattered. The first sign came as red and blue lights flashed behind him, slicing through the darkness like knives. Malik froze mid-step, his heart pounding as the sound of tires screeching to a halt pierced the silence. Two police cruisers blocked the narrow intersection ahead. His breath hitched as he turned slowly, raising his hands instinctively even though no command had been given yet. "Evening," Officer Greg Hartman barked, stepping out of his car with a swagger that radiated authority. His flashlight beam cut across Malik's face, blinding him momentarily. "What are you doing out here?" Malik blinked, trying to steady his voice. "I'm just walking home from work," he said calmly, gesturing toward the direction he'd come from. "Is there a problem?" Hartman ignored the question, circling Malik like prey. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. Hands where I can see them." "I haven't done anything wrong," Malik replied, frustration creeping into his tone despite his best efforts to remain composed. "Can you tell me what this is about?" Instead of answering, Hartman grabbed Malik's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Malik's shoulder as he stumbled forward, landing hard on the pavement. The asphalt scraped at his palms, leaving angry red marks. Humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain as Hartman pressed a knee into his spine. "You think you're smart, huh?" Hartman growled, leaning close enough for Malik to feel his breath. "Acting innocent doesn't mean you are." From her porch across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Carter watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Her gnarled fingers trembled as she fumbled for her phone, the screen illuminating her weathered face. She hesitated only briefly before hitting record, capturing every agonizing second. The harsh commands, the pleading protests, the raw brutality of power unchecked. The shaky footage would later ripple far beyond Birmingham, igniting outrage and debate nationwide. When Malik finally limped home hours later, bruised and humiliated, the weight of what happened settled over him like a suffocating blanket. His mother, Sharon, rushed to him, her hands fluttering anxiously as she inspected his injuries. "Oh, baby," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Not again." "It's not fair," Malik muttered, sinking onto the couch. His voice cracked under the strain of suppressed anger and exhaustion. "Why does it always have to be us? Why do they look at me and see a criminal instead of a person?" Sharon didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the phone and dialed their pastor, Reverend Isaiah Brooks. As she spoke softly into the receiver, Malik stared blankly at the wall, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. It wasn't just Hartman, it was everyone who looked away, who stayed silent, who accepted this kind of treatment as normal. By morning, the video Mrs. Carter filmed had gone viral. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMalik, turning him into an unwitting symbol of resistance. But fame brought scrutiny. Trolls dissected his past, dredging up old traffic tickets and noise complaints, twisting them into evidence of guilt by association. Comments flooded in, some supportive, but many cruel. "Why should we believe him?" one commenter wrote. "He's probably hiding something." Malik scrolled through the notifications on his phone, each hateful message chipping away at his resolve. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he strong enough to carry this burden? Could he fight not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been treated like less than human? Yet, amidst the chaos, something else emerged, a flicker of hope. Strangers reached out with messages of solidarity. Activists organized protests outside the precinct, demanding accountability. And somewhere deep inside, Malik felt a spark ignite. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than any single person. It was about justice, about proving that change was possible. As night fell once more, Malik stood by his bedroom window, staring out at the city lights. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many were counting on him to keep going. Malik pushed open the front door, his movements stiff and deliberate. Every step sent a fresh wave of pain through his bruised body, but it was the weight in his chest that felt heaviest. His mother, Sharon, stood in the living room, her hands flying to her mouth as she took in the sight of him. His torn shirt, the scrapes on his arms, the hollow look in his eyes. "Baby, what happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. Her voice trembled with a mix of fear and fury. "Who did this to you?" Malik sank onto the couch, wincing as the cushions pressed against his sore ribs. He didn't answer right away, staring down at his scraped palms instead. The words stuck in his throat, too bitter to speak aloud. Finally, he muttered, "It doesn't matter who." "You know why?" Sharon's face hardened, lines deepening around her mouth. She reached for the phone on the coffee table, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number from memory. "This is bigger than us," she said firmly. "We need help." On the other end of the line, Reverend Isaiah Brooks listened quietly as Sharon explained what had happened. His deep, steady voice came through the receiver moments later. "Bring him to the church tomorrow. We'll pray together, and we'll figure out our next steps." After hanging up, Sharon turned back to Malik, her expression softening. "Reverend Brooks will see us tomorrow. But tonight, just rest, okay? Let me take care of you." Malik nodded numbly, though sleep felt impossible. As Sharon busied herself making tea in the kitchen, he retreated into silence, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. Each flash of red and blue lights, each harsh word from Officer Hartman, echoed like a broken record. He clenched his fists, trying to push away the anger bubbling inside him, but it only grew stronger. By morning, whispers about the altercation had spread throughout the neighborhood. At the corner store, Mrs. Thompson shook her head sadly while stocking shelves. "Poor boy," she murmured to another customer. "They always pick on him. Always." Not far away, Mr. Jenkins leaned against his porch railing, arms crossed. "I don't know," he said to a neighbor. "Maybe there's more to the story. You can't trust these videos. They never show the whole truth." The divide widened quickly. Some rallied behind Malik, calling the incident an outrage and vowing to support him however they could. Others whispered doubts, questioning whether Malik might have provoked the officer somehow. The tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Meanwhile, online, the video filmed by Mrs. Evelyn Carter continued to gain traction. Hashtags like #JusticeForMalik trended nationwide, drawing both support and vitriol. Activists praised Malik's courage, urging people to demand accountability from law enforcement. But trolls swarmed in too, dissecting every detail of his past. A traffic ticket became evidence of recklessness. A noise complaint morphed into proof of aggression. Malik scrolled through the notifications on his phone, each comment cutting deeper than the last. "He probably deserved it," one user wrote. Another chimed in, "Why should we believe him? People like him always play the victim card." His hands shook as he set the phone down, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he strong enough to face this storm? Could he fight not just for himself, but for everyone else who'd been treated the same way? That evening, activists gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that red enough is enough and Black Lives Matter. Chants filled the air, no justice, no peace. As the crowd swelled with energy. But not everyone shared their sentiment. Across the street, a smaller group of counter-protesters held their ground, shouting accusations of their own. "He's lying. They're all lying," one man yelled, pointing angrily at the protesters. "You're tearing this city apart." Tensions flared during a candlelight vigil meant to unite the community. Voices rose in heated arguments, candles flickering wildly in the night breeze. Malik stood off to the side, watching it all unfold with a mixture of awe and dread. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He hadn't asked for any of this. As the crowd chanted his name, Malik felt a strange disconnect. They weren't seeing him, the real him. To them, he was a symbol, a rallying cry. But symbols couldn't feel pain or fear or exhaustion. Symbols didn't lie awake at night wondering if they were strong enough to keep fighting. Later, as he walked home alone, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He stopped under a streetlight, looking up at the stars. For a brief moment, he let himself imagine a different world. One where he could walk home without fear, where justice wasn't a battle but a given. Then reality snapped back into focus, sharp and unyielding. Malik took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many were counting on him to keep going. Malik sat alone in his dimly lit bedroom, the faint hum of a distant street lamp seeping through the cracks in his blinds. He clutched an old photograph in his hands, a faded black and white image of his grandfather, Elijah Johnson, standing tall despite the chains that had once bound him. The memory of Elijah's story came rushing back like a flood, vivid and unrelenting. It was 1963, Birmingham. Elijah had been walking home from work when two officers stopped him, accusing him of assaulting a white woman, a lie spun out of thin air. No evidence, no witnesses, just the color of his skin. The trial was a farce, the verdict predetermined. Elijah spent 5 years in prison before being exonerated, but the damage was done. His name was tarnished, his spirit broken, though he never let bitterness consume him. Instead, he taught his family to fight, not with fists, but with words, with truth. Malik closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that legacy settle over him like a heavy cloak. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. Asterisk, the world won't change unless you make a change. Asterisk, it was a lesson passed down through generations, one Malik carried with pride and pain. He thought about how little had changed since then. The same systems that had wrongfully imprisoned Elijah were still at work today, targeting people who looked like him, talked like him, lived like him. The next morning, Malik met Marcus at their usual spot, a small diner tucked away on the edge of town. They sat in a corner booth, steam rising from cups of coffee neither of them touched. Malik leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "I've been thinking about my grandfather," he began, "about what happened to him. And I realized something. It's not just me they're coming after. It's all of us. Every time they stop someone like me, they're trying to erase us, to make us forget who we are." Marcus nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "I get it, man. But you can't carry this alone. You need help." Malik hesitated, then said, "That's why I wanted to talk to you. About your uncle." Marcus stiffened, his cup halfway to his lips. "What about him?" "You didn't tell me he works in internal affairs," Malik pressed, his tone sharpening. "How long have you known? Were you ever going to say anything?" Marcus set his cup down with a sigh. "Look, I didn't know how to bring it up, okay? Yeah, my uncle's a cop, but he's not like the others. He hates what's happening as much as we do." Malik stared at him, disbelief warring with curiosity. "Then why hasn't he done anything about it?" "He has," Marcus replied quietly. "He's been gathering evidence, files, recordings, everything. Stuff that could blow this whole thing wide open. But he's scared, Malik. If anyone finds out what he's doing, the words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Malik felt torn. On one hand, here was an opportunity to expose the corruption he'd fought so hard against. On the other, trusting someone connected to law enforcement felt like betrayal. How could he reconcile the two? That night, Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The choice weighed heavily on him. If he worked with Detective Reed, he risked losing the trust of those who stood by him. But if he didn't, he might miss the chance to hold the system accountable for decades of injustice. Finally, he reached for his notebook and began writing. Not arguments or strategies, but questions. What kind of world did he want to build? One where fear dictated his actions, or one where courage led the way? By the time dawn broke, he knew what he had to do. The following day, Malik met Marcus outside the precinct. The building loomed above them, its cold brick facade a stark reminder of everything they were fighting against. Marcus glanced at him nervously. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Malik took a deep breath, nodding. "Yeah, let's go." As they stepped inside, Malik felt the familiar knot of tension tighten in his chest. But beneath it was something else, a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't matter. And Malik refused to let them down. Malik hesitated at the doorway of the community center, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The room buzzed with energy, voices overlapping, chairs scraping against the floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. He scanned the crowd, taking in the sea of faces, young and old, some wearing weary expressions, others radiating determination. This was Birmingham United Against Police Brutality, a group he'd heard whispers about but never imagined himself joining. As he stepped inside, a woman approached him with an outstretched hand. Her sharp eyes seemed to pierce through his guarded exterior. "You must be Malik," she said, her voice firm yet warm. "I'm Sarah Chun." Malik shook her hand, noting the calluses on her palm, a sign of someone who worked hard for what they believed in. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, his tone cautious. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I've been following your case. It's not just about you. It's about all of us. We need to turn this moment into momentum." Her words struck a chord, though Malik wasn't ready to admit it. He nodded slowly, unsure of how much trust he could place in this stranger. Still, there was something about her fiery determination that made him want to believe, just a little, that maybe things could change. Later that evening, after the meeting had wrapped up, Sarah pulled Malik aside. "Listen," she began, her voice low but intense. "I want to represent you. Pro bono. I think your case has the potential to expose systemic issues that have gone unchecked for far too long." Malik blinked, caught off guard. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "I don't need to," Sarah countered. "What I see is someone who's already fighting, not just for yourself, but for everyone else who's been silenced. Let me help you amplify that fight." For a moment, Malik didn't respond. Part of him wanted to say yes, to accept the lifeline she was offering. But another part, the part shaped by years of mistrust, held back. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice tight. Over the next few days, Malik threw himself into building alliances with other activists and community leaders. Meetings stretched late into the night, fueled by coffee and shared outrage. Slowly, bonds began to form. There was Marcus, whose quiet strength steadied Malik when doubt crept in, Mrs. Carter, whose unwavering faith reminded him why he started this journey, and countless others who brought their own stories, their own pain, to the table. But just as momentum began to build, a shadow fell over the group. Malik sat in stunned silence as Marcus revealed the truth about Mr. Franklin, a respected elder within the community. Years ago, Franklin had accepted hush money from the police union to bury another victim's story. The betrayal cut deep, leaving Malik questioning whether anyone could truly be trusted. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Malik demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Marcus sighed heavily, guilt etched across his face. "I didn't know how to bring it up. I thought we could move past it." Malik clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. For a moment, he considered walking away from the movement, from the fight, from everything. But then he remembered his grandfather's words. Asterisk, the world won't change unless you make a change. Asterisk, taking a deep breath, Malik stood up straighter. Betrayal hurt, but giving up would hurt more, not just for him, but for everyone counting on him to keep going. He turned to Marcus, his voice steady now. We can't let this break us. If anything, it should push us harder. By the end of the week, Malik had made his decision. He met Sarah at her office, a small space cluttered with legal books and papers. She looked up as he entered, raising an eyebrow expectantly. I've thought about it, Malik said, his voice resolute. And I'm ready to work with you. But this isn't just about my case anymore. It's about tearing down the system that lets stuff like this happen. Sarah smiled, a flicker of pride in her eyes. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. As they shook hands, Malik felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't and wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many were counting on him to keep fighting. The small office was cluttered with stacks of papers, old case files, and faded photographs spread across the table. Malik leaned over a pile of documents, his brow furrowed as he flipped through pages yellowed with age. Sarah sat beside him, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose, while Marcus hovered nearby, scrolling through his phone for digital records. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of what they were uncovering. This can't be a coincidence, Malik muttered, pointing to a pattern that had begun to emerge. 3 separate cases, each involving Officer Hartman, all dismissed or buried under bureaucratic red tape. Victims' names blurred together, but their stories were eerily similar. Accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, and intimidation. Sarah nodded grimly, jotting notes in the margins of one file. It's not just negligence, it's systemic. Someone higher up is making sure these complaints disappear. Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression tense. And whoever it is won't hesitate to come after us if we get too close. As the days passed, the investigation gained momentum, but so did the threats. Late one night, Malik returned home to find his front door slightly ajar. His heart raced as he pushed it open, stepping cautiously inside. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, their contents scattered across the floor. A single word scrawled in red spray paint on the wall sent chills down his spine. Stop. Sharon rushed in behind him, gasping at the sight. Malik, what happened? Who would do this? He clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. They're trying to scare me off. But I'm not backing down. That same week, an unknown number appeared on Malik's phone. He hesitated before answering, bracing himself for whatever came next. You don't know who you're messing with, a distorted voice growled on the other end. Drop this now, or you'll regret it. Malik hung up without responding, his hands trembling. For a moment, fear gripped him, but then he thought of all the people counting on him. He couldn't let them down. Just when it seemed like the pressure might break them, a breakthrough came. An anonymous email landed in Malik's inbox late one evening. Attached was a trove of internal documents detailing years of misconduct within the department. Among them were memos showing how higher-ups actively suppressed complaints against officers like Hartman. At the bottom of the message was a name, Lee Sing-Gwin. Whoever this is, they're risking everything to help us, Sarah said, her voice tinged with awe as she read through the files. But relief turned to panic when Lisa vanished shortly after sending the information. Calls went unanswered, messages left unreturned. Malik paced anxiously outside the precinct, scanning the crowd for any sign of her. We have to find her, he insisted. If something happens to her because of this, his voice trailed off, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. We will, but we need to stay sharp. If they silence her, they'll try to silence us next. Despite the mounting danger, Malik refused to back down. Sitting alone in his dimly lit apartment later that night, he stared at the stack of evidence piled on his desk. Each document represented someone's pain, someone's fight for justice, And now, it was his turn to carry that torch. He picked up a pen and began drafting a statement, his handwriting firm and deliberate. "No matter what happens to me," he wrote, "this truth needs to see the light. Too many lives depend on it." By morning, Malik had made his decision. He wouldn't stop, not until every layer of corruption was exposed, no matter the cost. As he stepped out into the crisp dawn air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Fear still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. This wasn't just about revenge or vindication anymore. It was about hope for himself, for Lisa, and for everyone else who deserved better than the world they'd been given. The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, every sound sharper. Outside, protesters chanted slogans like a heartbeat pulsing through the city. No justice, no peace. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers at their tables, reporters scribbled notes in cramped rows, and the jury sat stiffly, eyes darting between the opposing sides. Malik sat beside Sarah Chun, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. His gaze flickered toward the crowd, faces filled with hope, anger, fear, and then to Officer Hartman, who sat stoic, flanked by his defense team. Sarah rose first, her voice steady but charged with conviction. "This case isn't just about one man or one incident," she began, pacing slowly before the jury. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. It's about accountability for actions taken and lives impacted." When the defense attorney stood, his tone was calm, almost soothing. Officer Hartman followed protocol. He acted on information provided to him, doing what any officer would do under similar circumstances. The words hung in the air, painting two starkly different realities, one of systemic injustice, the other of justified authority. As opening statements concluded, the room felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of those conflicting truths pressed down on everyone present. But it was during cross-examination that the real storm broke. Sarah leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Officer Hartman, you've stated repeatedly that your actions were based solely on procedure. Yet we've uncovered evidence suggesting otherwise. Can you explain why so many complaints against you have mysteriously disappeared?" Hartman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at his lawyer for guidance. Before he could respond, Sarah pressed further. "Let's talk about your father. Isn't it true that he served time alongside Elijah Johnson, the grandfather of the plaintiff, in the 1960s? A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Hartman's face flushed red, his composure cracking. "What does that have to do with anything?" he snapped, his voice rising. "It has everything to do with this case," Sarah shot back, her eyes blazing. "Isn't it possible that your actions toward Malik Johnson weren't just about procedure, but about settling a score decades old?" Malik froze, the revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. His grandfather's wrongful imprisonment, a story he'd grown up hearing, wasn't just history. It was alive, festering beneath the surface of his own life. He turned to Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this really happening?" She nodded grimly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to hear it like this, but now we know exactly what we're fighting against." Later, alone in a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway, Malik leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. Generations of pain collided within him, threatening to overwhelm him. This wasn't just about proving innocence anymore. It was about breaking free from a cycle of hatred that stretched back farther than he'd realized. Marcus found him there, concern etched across his face. "You holding up okay?" Malik shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "How am I supposed to fight something this big? Something this personal?" "You don't have to do it alone," Marcus replied firmly. "We're all here with you. And whether they admit it or not, half the people in that courtroom are rooting for you too." Back inside, closing arguments loomed. As Sarah prepared her final remarks, Malik took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Hope still felt fragile, dangling precariously amidst chaos. But even in the face of uncertainty, he knew one thing for certain. Giving up wasn't an option. Not when so much more than his future depended on this fight. With renewed resolve, he stepped back into the courtroom, ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman of the jury stood, his voice steady but carrying the weight of countless lives. "We find Officer Hartman guilty of excessive force," he announced, pausing briefly before continuing, "but not guilty of racial profiling." A ripple of gasps swept through the room, followed by a mix of cheers and groans. For some, it was a victory, a crack in the wall of impunity that had long protected officers like Hartman. For others, it was yet another reminder of how justice often came up short when confronting systemic racism. Malik sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Relief flickered across his face, but it was fleeting, overshadowed by frustration and disbelief. Outside the courthouse, the division among the crowd mirrored the tension inside. Protesters held signs high, chanting slogans like asterisk, half measures aren't enough. Asterisk, while supporters of the verdict argued that any conviction against an officer was progress worth celebrating. Marcus approached Malik cautiously, his expression torn between pride and concern. "You did it, man," Marcus said softly, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "This is huge." Malik shook his head, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "Did I? They didn't even touch the heart of it, the reason this all started. It's like they saw what happened to me, but refused to see why it happened." Sarah joined them moments later, her usual fiery demeanor tempered by exhaustion. "It's not perfect," she admitted, "but it's something. A step forward. And sometimes, steps are all we get. A step." Malik shot back, his tone sharper than he intended. "What about everyone else who won't get their day in court? What about my grandfather? Was this supposed to fix everything?" His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Sarah didn't respond immediately, letting him vent the anger and disappointment he'd been holding in for days. Finally, she spoke gently. "No, it doesn't fix everything. But it shows people that change is possible, even if it's slow. You've already inspired so many to keep fighting. That matters." That night, protests erupted again in the streets of Birmingham. The verdict may have brought partial vindication, but it also reignited the flames of discontent. Chants echoed under the glow of streetlights, banners waved defiantly, and candles flickered in memory of those who had been lost to similar injustices. Malik watched from a distance, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to join the marchers, to lend his voice to their cries for deeper reforms. But another part felt too drained, too overwhelmed by the bittersweet nature of the outcome. Back at home, Sharon found him sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at the television screen, replaying news coverage of the verdict. She sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You're allowed to feel both ways, baby," she murmured. "Happy that there's some justice and mad that it wasn't enough. That just means you care." Malik nodded slowly, leaning into her embrace. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Ma. Fighting feels endless sometimes." Sharon smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But look how far you've come already. Every battle you fight chips away at the mountain. Even if it doesn't fall today, tomorrow might be different because of you." Her words lingered with him long after she left the room. By morning, Malik felt a small spark of hope rekindle within him. He picked up his notebook, flipping to a blank page. At the top he wrote, asterisk next steps. Asterisk beneath it, ideas began to flow, plans for community workshops, policy proposals, partnerships with activists nationwide. The verdict hadn't solved everything, but it had proven one thing. The fight wasn't over. Not for Malik, not for his community, and certainly not for the generations still waiting for true justice. As he stepped outside into the crisp dawn air, Malik felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he knew now more than ever that giving up wasn't an option. This wasn't just his fight, it belonged to everyone who believed in a better future. Malik sat at the small wooden desk in his bedroom, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Before him lay an open notebook, its pages blank but heavy with possibility. He picked up his pen and hesitated for a moment, then began to write. Dear Grandpa Elijah, I wish you were here to see this, to see me standing up for what's right. I know it's not easy. Some days, it feels impossible. But every time I think about what they did to you, how they tried to break you, I remember that you never let them win. And neither will I, he paused, his hand trembling slightly as memories flooded back. The stories his mother told him about Elijah's wrongful imprisonment, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself even after being released. Malik swallowed hard and continued writing. I promise to keep fighting, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been treated less than human because of the color of their skin. Your strength is my strength now, and I won't stop until things change. When he finished, Malik folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the worn photo album, where he kept Elijah's picture. As he closed the book, he felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. The scars of the past weren't gone. They would always be part of him. But they had also shaped him into someone stronger, more determined. The next morning, Malik stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. His face was still marked by exhaustion, but there was something else too, a glimmer of defiance. He thought about everything he'd endured, the nights spent poring over case files, the threats that made sleep elusive, the moments when doubt crept in and whispered that maybe none of this mattered. Yet here he was, still standing, still fighting. Every scar tells a story, he murmured to himself, tracing the faint bruise on his cheekbone from the night Officer Hartman had detained him. And every story can teach us something. With renewed clarity, Malik turned his attention to drafting legislation aimed at increasing transparency within law enforcement. He spread out papers across the dining table, notes jotted during late-night brainstorming sessions, research articles highlighting systemic flaws, and outlines of potential policies. Sarah joined him later, sipping coffee as she reviewed his work. This is good, she said, pointing to a section about mandatory body cameras. But we need to push harder on accountability measures. Policies mean nothing if no one enforces them. Malik nodded, scribbling furiously in the margins. What about citizen oversight boards? Something independent, so people feel like they actually have a voice. Sarah smiled approvingly. Exactly. Let's make sure these ideas get heard. Over the following weeks, Malik threw himself into lobbying local lawmakers. It wasn't easy. Some dismissed him outright, while others promised support but offered little action. But slowly, alliances began to form. Activists, community leaders, and even a few sympathetic politicians rallied around his cause, united by a shared vision of reform. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with a skeptical council member, Malik leaned against the wall outside City Hall, exhaling deeply. Marcus approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. You okay? He asked, handing one to Malik. I don't know, Malik admitted, taking a sip. Some days, it feels like we're getting nowhere. Like all this effort might not matter in the end. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. It matters. Even if we don't see the results right away, it matters. You're planting seeds, man. Someone else will water them. And eventually, something will grow. Those words stayed with Malik as he walked home under the fading light of dusk. Despite the challenges ahead, he allowed himself a small smile. Hope wasn't gone. It was simply anchored in action now. Each step forward, no matter how small, brought him closer to the future he envisioned. One where justice wasn't a privilege, but a guarantee for everyone. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt ready to take that future into his own hands. In the weeks following Malik's trial, something remarkable began to take shape. The verdict, imperfect as it was, had ignited a fire that refused to die out. Community members who had once stood on opposite sides of protests now gathered in shared spaces, united by a common goal: dismantling the systemic racism that had plagued their city for generations. At a local church hall, rows of folding chairs filled quickly as people streamed in from all walks of life. Elderly women in Sunday hats sat beside teenagers wearing hoodies. Business owners exchanged nods with activists clutching clipboards. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. On stage, Malik stood alongside Sarah and Marcus, his hands gripping the podium tightly. We've been divided for too long, Malik began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. But this moment, it's ours. Together, we can build something better. Something lasting. His words resonated deeply. People nodded, some wiping away tears, others raising clenched fists in solidarity. After years of feeling powerless against injustice, they finally saw a path forward, one paved not just by anger, but by collective action. The momentum carried into community forums held across Birmingham. In one packed auditorium, residents faced off with police officers during a tense yet transformative town hall meeting. A young mother named Tasha spoke first, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm scared every time my son leaves the house. Scared he won't come back because someone sees him as a threat instead of a kid." Her words hung heavy in the room, punctuated by murmurs of agreement. One officer, a middle-aged man named Officer Ramirez, shifted uncomfortably before speaking up. "I hear you," he said slowly, "and I know we haven't done enough to earn your trust. But if you'll let us, we want to do better." It wasn't a perfect exchange, far from it, but it marked the beginning of a dialogue that had long been avoided. Over the next few months, these conversations became more frequent, each one chipping away at the walls of mistrust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Meanwhile, tangible changes started taking root. Under mounting pressure from activists and newly formed coalitions, the police department announced sweeping reforms. Mandatory body cameras for all officers, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and implicit bias training programs. While critics argued these steps were small compared to the scale of the problem, Malik knew they represented progress, a crack in the armor of systemic indifference. Change doesn't happen overnight, Malik told a group of high school students during a workshop he led later that spring. He paced the classroom, holding up flyers about knowing their rights during police encounters. But every policy change, every tough conversation, brings us closer to where we need to be. The students listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and determination. One boy raised his hand hesitantly. What if nothing changes after all this? What if it's just talk? Malik paused, considering the question. Then he smiled faintly. "That's why we keep pushing. If we stop fighting, then, yeah, it stays just talk. But if we stay loud, stay visible, stay organized, they'll have no choice but to listen." By summer, signs of progress were undeniable. At a community event celebrating recent victories, Malik looked out over a sea of faces, young and old, black and white, all united under banners proclaiming justice for all. Children ran through the crowd, laughing as balloons bobbed above their heads. Nearby, volunteers handed out pamphlets detailing upcoming campaigns and voter registration drives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Malik climbed onto a makeshift stage. The microphone squealed briefly before settling into clarity. "We did this," he said simply, his voice carrying across the park. "Not me. Not any one person. Us. Together." Cheers erupted, echoing through the warm evening air. For a moment, Malik allowed himself to feel hope, not the fragile kind that flickers in uncertainty, but the solid, rooted kind born of hard-won victories. Challenges still loomed ahead, he knew that. But standing there, surrounded by people who believed in a brighter future, he felt certain of one thing. The fight was far from over, but neither was the promise of change. And sometimes that was enough to keep moving forward. Malik stood at the front of a sunlit classroom, his hands resting lightly on a wooden podium. The room buzzed with quiet energy as teenagers shuffled in their seats, some scribbling notes, while others leaned forward eagerly. On the whiteboard behind him were bold words written in black marker. Asterisk, know your rights. Use your voice. Asterisk, let me ask you something. Malik began, his voice warm but firm. How many of you feel like your voices don't matter? A few students hesitated before raising their hands tentatively. One boy near the back kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Another girl raised her hand high, her expression defiant. You're not alone, Malik continued, pacing slowly along the rows of desks. I used to think the same thing, Like no one would listen unless I yelled loud enough. But here's the truth. Your voice matters more than you realize. It's not about yelling. It's about knowing where and how to speak up. He paused, pulling out a small stack of flyers from his bag. Each one listed basic rights during police encounters, resources for reporting misconduct, and steps for organizing community action. As he handed them out, he locked eyes with the boy in the back. This isn't just information, it's power. And when we work together, that power grows. The next day, Malik found himself surrounded by a group of teens outside the local library. They huddled around a table covered in posters and laptops, brainstorming ideas for a campaign to address racial profiling in schools. A 16-year-old named Jasmine took charge, her voice steady despite the nerves evident in her fidgeting hands. "We could start with petitions," she suggested, tapping her pen against the notebook in front of her. "Get students to sign on, then present them to the school board." Another teen, Marcus Jr., no relation to Malik's friend Marcus, nodded enthusiastically. "And what about social media? We can share stories, show people this is real, that it happens everywhere." Malik watched silently, pride swelling in his chest as they debated strategies and assigned tasks. These kids weren't waiting for someone else to fix things. They were stepping up, taking ownership of their future. When Jasmine turned to him for approval, he gave her a reassuring smile. "You've got this," he said simply. "Trust yourselves." Weeks later, Malik unveiled his new initiative, Youth Advocates for Justice. In a packed community center, he stood beside a group of young leaders who had already begun making waves. Posters lined the walls showcasing their campaigns. Everything from workshops on voter registration to rallies demanding policy changes in local government. "This program isn't just about teaching you how to fight injustice," Malik explained to the crowd gathered for the launch event. "It's about showing you that you already have the tools within you. All you need is guidance and each other." As he spoke, his eyes scanned the audience, landing on faces filled with hope and determination. Some were parents, others teachers or neighbors, all there to support the rising generation of advocates. Among them sat Sharon, beaming with pride as she clapped loudly. By winter, the impact of Malik's mentorship was undeniable. Teenagers led marches through downtown Birmingham, chanting slogans they'd crafted themselves. Others organized town halls, inviting city officials to answer tough questions about accountability and equity. At one such meeting, a soft-spoken girl named Tarek stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm tired of being told I'm too young to understand," she said, addressing a panel of school administrators. "We see what's happening. We live it every day. If you won't listen to us now, when will you?" Her words sent ripples through the room, prompting applause and nods of agreement. For Malik, watching from the sidelines, moments like these affirmed everything he'd worked for. These young people weren't just challenging stereotypes, they were shattering them, proving that age didn't define capability or courage. On a crisp spring morning, Malik returned to the same classroom where it all began. This time, however, the park was alive with energy, a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds under the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight. Banners fluttered in the breeze, emblazoned with messages like "Justice for All" and "Together we rise." Children darted between booths set up by local organizations, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic beats of a live drum circle. At the center of it all stood Malik, his figure silhouetted against the horizon as he prepared to address the crowd. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just another rally. It was a celebration of how far they'd come, a testament to resilience in the face of adversity. As he stepped onto the stage, cheers erupted from every corner of the park. People clapped, whistled, and raised fists in solidarity. Malik scanned the sea of faces before him, young and old, black and white, united not by circumstance, but by choice. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here today, for showing up, for speaking out, for refusing to stay silent when silence would have been easier." His gaze lingered on familiar faces. Sharon, her eyes glistening with pride. Marcus, nodding encouragingly. Jasmine and the other young leaders who had taken the reins of change into their own hands. Beyond them were strangers, some carrying signs, others holding hands with loved ones, all bound together by a shared hope for something better. "We've won battles," Malik continued, his tone shifting to acknowledge both triumph and truth. "But let's be clear, this fight isn't over. There are still systems that need dismantling, biases that need unlearning, hearts that need opening. And while we celebrate what we've achieved, we must also remember why we started." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding in agreement. Malik paused, letting the words sink in. He thought about the nights spent strategizing, the protests that stretched into dawn, the moments of doubt that threatened to pull him under. But most of all, he thought about the people standing before him now, their courage, their determination, their refusal to give up. "This movement doesn't belong to me or any one person," he said, his voice rising above the hum of the crowd. "It belongs to all of us, to the elders who march before us, teaching us what it means to persevere, to the youth who remind us that the future is worth fighting for, to the allies who stand beside us, proving that justice knows no color." As he spoke, Malik felt a surge of gratitude, a recognition that this journey, though painful at times, had never truly been his alone. It was carried forward by countless hands, voices, and dreams. When he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, echoing across the park like a promise kept. When the event began to wind down, Malik found himself standing at the edge of the stage, watching as families packed up blankets and volunteers dismantled booths. The air smelled faintly of barbecue smoke and fresh grass, remnants of a day well spent. A young girl approached him shyly, clutching a handmade sign that read asterisk, "Hope starts here." "Asterisk, are you Malik?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the lingering chatter. "I am," he replied, kneeling to meet her eye level. "And who are you?" "I'm Layla," she said, her cheeks flushing pink. "I want to say thank you. My mom says because of people like you, things can get better." Malik smiled, touched by her sincerity. "Things will get better," he assured her, gently tapping the sign she held. "Because of people like you too." As Layla skipped back to her family, Malik turned his attention skyward. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting streaks of orange and purple across the heavens. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what lay beyond, to dream of a world where equality wasn't an aspiration but a reality. The camera panned upward, following his gaze. Clouds drifted lazily, endless and untethered, symbolizing the boundless potential of collective action. Below, the park buzzed with life, proof that even in the face of immense challenges, hope could take root and grow. Malik exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of purpose renewed within him. The road ahead would be long, fraught with obstacles, yet unseen. But as he looked out at the diverse tapestry of humanity gathered around him, he knew one thing for certain. They were ready. Together, they would keep pushing forward, one step, one voice, one victory at a time. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Jasmine, Marcus Jr., Tariq, and several others, ready to lead a workshop for a new group of students. As they introduced themselves, Malik stepped back, letting them take center stage. Watching them interact with the younger kids, answering questions, and sharing their experiences, Malik felt a deep sense of fulfillment settle over him. He thought about Elijah, his grandfather, and wondered if this was what he'd envisioned when he taught resilience to his family decades ago. Maybe change wouldn't happen overnight. Maybe there would always be battles left to fight. But as Malik looked at the faces of those young leaders, determined, fearless, unstoppable, he knew one thing for certain. Hope had taken root. And as long as it did, the future would belong to those brave enough to shape it. If you enjoyed this story and its characters, don't forget to subscribe for more. Your support through subscriptions and comments motivates us to keep creating and sharing new stories. If you have a favorite genre or theme you'd like to see more of, feel free to share in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for being here, and we hope you continue to enjoy our work.